Open your Bibles to 1 Samuel chapter 4. We're going to carry on in the book of Samuel. It's been a while just because of how things work out with our preaching schedules. So I just want to do a recap of what we looked at before. Firstly, there is coming a new beginning in Israel. The miracle of Samuel's birth, foreshadowing the birth of John the Baptist. God scatters these little clues around in the Bible. And he was doing something new in Israel. And there's a new hope. There was a division between believers and unbelievers. It had become apparent. And there's also the foreshadowing of judgment. When Hannah prayed, she talked to the Lord of hosts. We just sang about him in our first hymn. Lord Sabaoth, his name, Lord of hosts, the one who's got an army and is coming to judge. You're not going to stand up against that army if you try. And then a look at what was happening with the worthless sons of Eli, the denigration of the faith of Israel by worthless men who were supposed to be priests and guiding the people in following God, and instead they were doing whatever satisfied themselves. And then the call of Samuel, a rare word in those days, it says. It called him to be the last judge and the first of Israel's national prophets. And just a reminder, I think I've said this before, not only is every battle a spiritual battle, and there are plenty of battles in the Bible, as we saw in the book of Judges, but everything is a spiritual battle. We have a lot of talk, or have heard a lot of talk about spiritual warfare. And I heard of a lady who took apparently holy oil. I don't know how it got to be more holy than other oil. And she anointed her windows and doors so the demons couldn't come in. Well, actually, that's not going to help. I bet you she forgot about the hatch in the roof as well. But that's not going to help. But you do engage in spiritual warfare all the time. When you open your eyes, what's the first thing you think of? The trouble of the day, or trouble that might come that day? Do you get up in time to have a quiet time? Because your enemy, still that ancient foe, doesn't actually want you to get time in the Bible. So it's a lot easier to sleep. And, it's been a long day yesterday and I didn't sleep well. Let's just sleep in. Spiritual battle. So everything is a spiritual battle. And now we come to a sad episode and we can learn lessons for ourselves. But again, what Scripture does is not only do that, it also helps you get a view of the nature of God. And Samuel here fades from the account for a moment. There's no mention of him until chapter 7. But in the meantime, we see something of what's happening in Israel and their spiritual life. What's really going on behind the scenes? Now, they're butting heads against the Philistines. And just a note on the Philistines, that's with a capital P. The Philistines weren't actually Philistines with a small p. They're actually a very cultured people with an appreciation of art. We know this from archaeology, and very fine implements they made. And they also used iron. Now, you think that's not up to much, but, well, we've got steel now, which is even better. But when you're up against people with iron weapons, and all your weapons are bronze, which is a lot softer, they've got an advantage. And that's why eventually the Bronze Age, in archaeological terms, gave way to the Iron Age. And the Philistines were descended from Ham, the son of Noah, who wasn't his favorite son, if you recall right. And from ancient records, they seem to have come from somewhere in the Mediterranean area around Crete. So they were invaders, in fact. They had come and staked their claim on the coastal plain of Israel. And it spread all the way up from Ashkelon, which is almost level with Jerusalem, all the way down the coastal area to Gaza, of which you may recently have heard. There's nothing new about a war in Gaza. And they were supposed to have been removed by the Israelites when they invaded the land, along with the Jebusites and Arkites and all the other ites. They were supposed to have been conquered and either killed or chased out. They had the choice. But the Israelites failed to do that. And hence there were these ongoing battles. You remember Samson kept banging heads with with the Philistines and dealing with them as a judge of Israel. And in fact, the Philistines persisted all the way through until the Assyrians and Babylonians eliminated them or chased them off. So let's turn to 1 Samuel chapter 4. We read from 1 to 11. And the word of Samuel came to all Israel, and that might mean that he actually told them to go out to fight. Now Israel went out to battle against the Philistines. They encamped at Ebenezer. And this is an anachronism because this place wasn't called Ebenezer at that stage, but it's for the people who read later. And the Philistines encamped at Aphek. The Philistines drew up in line against Israel, and when the battle spread, Israel was defeated by the Philistines, who killed about 4,000 men on the field of battle. And when the troops came to the camp, the elders of Israel said, "Why has the Lord defeated us today before the Philistines?" An interesting choice of words. "Let us bring the ark of the covenant of the Lord here from Shiloh, that it may come among us and save us from the power of our enemies." So the people sent to Shiloh and brought from there the ark of the covenant of the Lord of hosts, who is enthroned on the cherubim. Again, the Lord of hosts, the judge. And the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were there with the ark of the covenant of God. As soon as the ark of the covenant of the Lord came into the camp, all Israel gave a mighty shout, so that the earth resounded. And when the Philistines heard the noise of the shouting, they said, "What does this great shouting in the camp of the Hebrews mean?" And when they had learned that the ark of the Lord had come to the camp, the Philistines were afraid, for they said, "A god has come into the camp." And they said, "Woe to us, for nothing like this has ever happened before. Woe to us! Who can deliver us from the power of these mighty gods?" These are the gods who struck the Egyptians with every sort of plague in the wilderness. "Take courage and be men, O Philistines, lest you become slaves to the Hebrews, as they have been to you. Be men and fight." So the Philistines fought, and Israel was defeated, and they fled every man to his home. And there was a very great slaughter, for there fell of Israel 30,000 foot soldiers. And the ark of God was captured, and the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, died. Well, the Philistines had some very good theology and some very iffy theology as well. You see that? But we're concentrating today on the ark and what happened. You see what the Israelites did? We've got to have the ark with us. They were using it as an amulet. Now, an amulet is a sort of a magical thing in pagan religions. I don't know if you'll remember it. I tried to look it up on YouTube and thought I'd play the clip, but for some reason they don't have it. William Tolo, a young man from the Underberg area, became a runner. And South Africa wasn't allowed to compete internationally at that stage until 1992. And he went almost unknown, and he won the New York Marathon. This is a big thing in America, in American running anyway. You win the New York Marathon. But I remember distinctly seeing him on TV, and he was running, and he had a red string on his wrist. And as he was coming up to the finish, and there was a Mexican guy ahead of him, and he was pushing and eventually passed him, he was holding the string and fingering it. And later at the press conference, one of the American commentators had noticed, and they said, "Oh, we saw you holding on that string. Is that magic?" And you could see he was a bit embarrassed because he wasn't going to explain all of African traditional religion to them. And he just said, "Yes, magic." Well, no, it wasn't magic. He's trying to get help from his ancestors to win the race. And he did win the race, but I don't think the ancestors had anything to do with it. You see, the string was an amulet. He can make contact with the spirit world through that. Sometimes people do it with a charm. They wear a crystal around their necks because that's apparently a spiritual thing as well. It's a magical thing to summon help from the spirit world. Some people have St. Christopher's medallions on the dashboard of their car. I remember for some reason we had one when I was a kid. You can't do that these days. Well, it was magnetic, but you can't use that these days because the dashboard is plastic. But we always had this little medallion there. And other people have rosaries hanging from their mirrors. You've seen that. I don't know if that helps. I can't say it does. Other people carry a rabbit's foot as a good luck thing. You know, as long as I've got my rabbit's foot, I'm okay. If they lose it, they panic. It didn't do the rabbit much good, I can tell you that. But that's common in pagan religions. You'll see a lot of the Hindus wear a string as well. Yeah. And they trying to manipulate their gods. And so armies would carry either the idol of their god into battle, which is what the Philistines thought the Israelites were doing, or they'd have symbols on their standards. The Roman legions used to have these standards and medallions on them, and at the top there was an eagle. And when they arrived in Israel and wanted to enter Jerusalem, there was an absolute riot, of course, because that's a graven image. And so Israel, because of the trouble, they were excluded from having to have the Roman standards in Jerusalem, and they had to leave them outside. But the Israelites here were doing exactly what all the pagans were doing. Exactly. We can't win unless we got the Ark of God here. Well, what was the Ark? It was a chest made of wood, covered in gold, and it contained several things. Aaron's rod, which had budded. Remember, Aaron had a rod, and as a sign, God caused this dead piece of wood to bud. The 10 Commandment tablets. It must have been pretty heavy to carry because they were big slabs of stone. And a pot of manna, which didn't go off like the manna used to. And the lid of the ark had 2 cherubim statues on each side. Angels, symbolizing the presence of God and the worship of God. And then in the middle, it was called the mercy seat. And on the Day of Atonement, the high priest would go in with the blood of the sacrifice and sprinkle the blood on it to atone, to cover up the sins of Israel for that year. It didn't actually do that. It was the faith of Israel in the forthcoming sacrifice of Christ that did it, or the faith of individuals. But the ark was supposed to stay in the tabernacle. Nobody was even supposed to see it except the high priest on one day of the year. Now they're lugging it around like luggage. It wasn't supposed to be carried into battle. It was supposed to be the center of Israel's worship, the focal point where their sins were forgiven by faith in God. And the cross has been abused like that. Cross is much the same as the ark, a place where the wrath of God was satisfied. I've said this before and I'll say it again. The human race are at war with God, enemies. And so God's rightfully upset with them, and upset is an understatement. He's angry enough to kill them. And yet, he gave a sacrifice, which we've just celebrated, to turn away his wrath from us and onto Christ. And yet we abuse it. It becomes jewelry. Now, there's nothing wrong with wearing a cross as a symbol. But a lot of people just wear a cross. And they don't even know what it's about. Or we jokingly make a sign to refute something. You know, if someone comes and they've got flu and they cough near you, you go like this, right? We've all done that sort of thing, you know. The Emperor Constantine claimed, when there was a civil war in Rome, in the Roman Empire, he claimed to have had a vision of the cross in the clouds and the words, "Conquer under this sign." And so he had all his soldiers paint a cross on their shields, and he won. You see, the ark was not an amulet to call up God in time of trouble. And we tend to do that, don't we? We're in trouble. Better call up God. You know, they say there's no atheists in foxholes or examination rooms because you didn't study enough and now you're in trouble. And Lord, if you'll just help me pass this exam, I won't ever waste time on Saturday night again when I should be studying. You see, it's not an amulet like that, like the pagans have. And we can plead the blood of Christ, which we just did. Without the blood of Christ, we're doomed. And we can plead that, but not if we ignore it at other times. Oh, we only remember once a month at communion. And you see, the ark was ignored. Remember the sons of Eli, the two priests? They were described as Belial, worthless men. They were scoundrels. And the book of Samuel recounts some of their deeds. And the way that word Belial is used carries the idea of wickedness or godliness, usually with an immoral connotation. They were immoral men. Faith in God had no place in their lives. This was just a job. Oh, now we get to do an outing as well. We're going down to Aphek with the Ark of God. They might have even been put out because that was a heavy ark to carry. But they were happy to profit and then carry the ark into battle, probably for money. So it was treated badly as an amulet. And then it was abused in another way. Years and years ago, I had a German friend. She'd come out from Germany with her family, had immigrated here. And she was staying with a friend of mine. And it turned out she was about 17 at that stage. All her life in Germany, she'd been involved in all sorts of strange things. You know, glassy, we call it, where you move a glass, you have numbers or letters on the table and the glass moves, and a few other things. That's why you should never, 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 never celebrate Halloween. It's really bad. You're opening up to things that you don't understand. Just keep the door shut. But she'd been involved in all these things, and she used to scare herself because it would sometimes tell her things that she didn't want to know. We know who was behind it, of course. But anyway, she'd come here, and then one day her friend, or rather before that, we decided, she needs a Bible. And we hunted around in Joburg. We got her a German Bible. And she started reading it. But then one day a friend of hers came out from Germany to visit. And they were alone in the house. And they started going back to this glassy thing. And it got frightening. But now the friend had to go to the car, which is outside, in the dark. How are we going to get to the car? And she had an idea. She went and got her Bible, because we can walk to the car with the Bible. As if that's going to help. And this is exactly what they did with the ark. We're in big trouble. The Philistines have defeated us. Hey, we'll get the ark. That'll make us safe. And it's not the way it was supposed to be used, and it's not the way the Bible is supposed to be used. It wasn't to be carried into battle. It was supposed to stay in the tabernacle. And nobody but the high priest was even supposed to see it. And now it's a spectacle and a charm. It was being misused, and it was a rallying point, something to scare the Philistines with. And it did scare them. If you look at verses 6 to 8, they had heard of this God of Israel. When the Philistines heard the noise of the shouting, they said, "What does this great shouting in the camp of the Hebrews mean?" And when they learned that the ark of the Lord had come to the camp, the Philistines were afraid, for they said, "A God has come into the camp." And they said, "Woe to us, for nothing like this has happened before. Woe to us! Who can deliver us from the power of these mighty gods?" Good theology there. These are the gods, actually only one God, who struck the Egyptians with every sort of plague in the wilderness. It's funny that interesting, they go back to the Egyptians. Egypt had been the world's superpower. They were the only people who could be counted as a superpower back then. They held influence even up in Canaan. We know that from archaeology. In fact, most of Canaan was subservient to the Egyptian empire at one stage. And the 10 plagues at the time of the Exodus had absolutely devastated the empire. Economically, you wipe out all your cattle and all your crops. It has an effect on the whole country. It affected them spiritually because the 10 plagues struck at the Egyptian idols. You're trusting in idols for food. Well, watch this. Bang. You trust in idols. The sun god. Okay, we switch the sun off. Remember, there was darkness over the land of Egypt. And the Egyptian idols were all half man, half animal. They'd have animal heads. And God struck at those idols. And then their army was drowned. Wiped out. Possibly Pharaoh drowned too, we're not certain. But now you've got no economy, no army, and no invisible means of support. You can't even trust your gods anymore. And Egypt never recovered completely. And then when Israel invaded Canaan, you'll remember Rahab and Jericho helped them, helped the spies. And Rahab said this, I know that the Lord has given you the land and that the fear of you has fallen upon us, and all the inhabitants of the land melt away before you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the 2 kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon and Og. And as soon as we heard it, our hearts melted. And there's no spirit left in any man because of you. For the Lord your God, he is God in the heavens, above and on the earth. There's a pagan woman, Canaanite, who's got better theology than the Israelites had here. We've heard what God did. We've heard what God has done in the past. And now the Philistines say, well, this God has come into the camp of Hebrews to fight on their side. They had a bad understanding. God isn't stuck in one place between 2 golden statues. He doesn't have to be carried around. God is everywhere, but they didn't realize that. But they were scared of being exterminated, and that made them fight harder. And the ark, this whole thing was unnecessary. All the effort was wasted. There was no need to bring the ark out to threaten the enemy. God had promised to fight on the side of Israel. You can read it several times in the Old Testament. And even if you go a little further in Samuel, David fought and overcame various people without having the ark. God had promised to fight on the side of Israel if they obeyed him and kept his commandments. But if they did not, and from previous chapters in this book and the book of Judges, we know they did not, he would hand them over. And all their fighting, all their skill, even if they could acquire iron weapons, it wouldn't help them. Oliver Cromwell said, apparently, it is a strange thing that every man who wages war believes that God is on his side. I'll wager God must often wonder who is on his. And Israel at this stage was not on God's side. And if we are not on God's side, we are enemies of God. Listen, this whole episode of the ark was a waste of effort as well as being bad theology. And listen to the promises and warnings they had already received. Deuteronomy chapter 11, God said, if you will be careful to do all this commandment that I command you to do, loving the Lord your God, walking in all his ways and holding fast from him, then the Lord will drive out all these nations before you, and you will dispossess nations greater and mightier than you, like the Philistines. No one shall be able to stand against you. The Lord your God will lay the fear of you and the dread of you on all the land that you shall tread, as he promised you. Leviticus chapter 26. If you walk in my statutes and observe my commandments and do them, you shall chase your enemies, and they shall fall before you by the sword. 5 of you shall chase 100, and 100 of you shall chase 10,000, and your enemies shall fall before you by the sword. But if you will not listen to me and will not do all these commandments, if you spurn my statutes, then I will do this to you. I will set my face against you, and you shall be struck down before your enemies. Those who hate you shall rule you, and you shall flee when none pursues you. And we see this working out in this chapter. Obey God and His word, all will be well with you. Disobey, and you're on your own. And they ended up on their own here. And then finally, we look at verse 18, we see how the glory departed. Just the following up. As soon as the ark is captured and a man comes from the battlefield and tells Eli that Israel's fled before the Philistines, there's been a great defeat. Your two sons also, Hophni and Phinehas are dead, and the ark of God has been captured. Verse 18, as soon as he mentioned the ark of God, Eli fell backward from his seat by the side of the gate, and his neck was broken, and he died, for the man was old and heavy. And we go down further down, his daughter-in-law, the wife of Phinehas, was pregnant, about to give birth. And when she heard the news, the ark of God was captured, and that her father-in-law and her husband were dead, she bowed and gave birth, for her pains were upon her. And about the time of her death, the woman attending to her said, do not be afraid, for you have borne a son. But she did not answer or pay attention. And she named this child Ichabod, saying, the glory has departed from Israel, because the ark of God had been captured, and because of her father-in-law and her husband. And she said, the glory has departed from Israel, for the ark of God has been captured. Terrible word, Ichabod. Ichabod is glory, the wonderful presence of God, and now it's Ichabod, no glory. But it wasn't because of the ark of the God, ark had been captured. But it happened long before that. Because if the priests were evil and their father failed to discipline or rebuke them, you can imagine what the rest of the nation was like. We see, I suppose you could call it a disease among churches, where the Word of God stops being that important and gets questioned, and all sorts of other practices come in, and you can bet your life, as what Paul was saying about homosexual marriage. A lot of churches are going to go along with that. We had a saying when I was at college years ago, whatever you see in the college now, you'll see in 10 years in the churches. And as the colleges went downhill, the churches have gone downhill. You can imagine what the rest of the nation was like, and if you read the last few chapters of the book of Judges, you'll get an idea. See, the stealing of the ark was actually irrelevant. God had long departed from Israel. He is gone because they weren't obeying His commandments. They hadn't driven out all these Amorites and Canaanites as He told them to. They'd made pacts with them, intermarried with them, taken up their practices, mixed the two religions together. And God departed from them, and they were defeated, and misusing the ark made no difference to them. Oh, what has this got to do with us? We don't have an ark. If we did, a box covered in pure gold would probably be stolen quite soon, and our insurance would be a lot higher. Well, as I've said, many churches start to fall under this name, Ichabod. In the United Kingdom, which once sent out so many missionaries and influenced the whole world with the churches and the Church Missionary Society, London Missionary Society, thousands of churches are now mosques. Beautiful, beautiful Gothic churches and Methodist chapels are now mosques. The glory had departed. I personally know a church where I grew up, in the area I grew up. One of the churches used to be an Anglican church. It's now a center for some sort of New Age meditation. Another church, also Anglican, is now a synagogue, Orthodox synagogue. Not far from here, I've been told, there's a church where the minister preaches that the book of Genesis is a myth. Ichabod. And on it goes, church after church. We're seeing this happen all around the world. The glory of God has departed from them because they were unfaithful, and they kept man's laws and statutes and cultural demands rather than the laws of God. Now, this church tries to be faithful. We're careful who preaches from here. We're careful who becomes members. We insist on taking the Bible seriously as it is written. I'm not saying, well, actually, because of the tides and the way the geography is, the Israelites actually just walked through about 2 inches of water. Well, God then managed to drown the entire Egyptian army and their chariots and horses in 2 inches of water, but no one's gone that far. We take the Bible seriously. We guard our pulpit. We teach the faith first entrusted to the saints. I think if St. Paul came back and heard our teachings, he wouldn't object, because we're doing what the early church did. Jesus said in his parable of the persistent widow that God is on the side of his people. Make no mistake about that. And people or groups who assault Christians are just stacking up trouble for themselves. But he said this in Luke chapter 18, "Will not God give justice to his elect who cry to him day and night? Will he delay long over them? I tell you, he will give justice to them speedily. Nevertheless, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on the earth?" Will he find faith, or will he find people who use Christ and his cross and his communion as charms to try and manipulate God to follow their agenda? I thought originally it's a coincidence that I end up preaching this just after Reformation Day. Well, it's not so much of a coincidence. That's exactly what was happening in the church at the time of Martin Luther. You can pay to get your grandmother out of purgatory. Costs though. And then you get a certificate with her name on it that she's been released. The Pope's granted her a way out. Actually, there is no purgatory, so we won't even go there. But then there's another thing. You go and pray before some bones, which are supposed to be John the Baptist's, or various other relics, somebody's fingernail clippings, somebody's lock of hair, and you get years of purgatory. That's the sort of thing that was happening. That's why he nailed the 95 Theses on the door. He wasn't fixing the door, he was fixing theology. And that's why today we come, and this is the final word. I don't actually care what any pope says, particularly the current one. This is the bottom line. I don't care what Parliament says about marriage. This says something different. Amen. Will he find faith, or will he find people who use Christ and his cross and his communion as charms? God is bigger than we can imagine, and we cannot bring him down to our size, like as if he's our champion, our Mike Tyson, who's going to come and fight for us. You can't domesticate him, and that's why it's so important to keep the word, because it keeps reminding us, as I said, of the nature of God, the vast difference between ourselves and of God. And this is the word of God. Amen.